My second video on this channel was all about Metro 2033 and environmental storytelling. Now, I always wanted to talk about something else as well, but I never got the chance because it just didn't really fit with the video. So I decided, why not do it now? And that thing is language. Now, if you don't know anything about the development of the Metro games, they are based on a series of Russian novels by Dmitry Coetzee, and they are developed by a Ukrainian Maltese studio called 4A Games. Now, you might then think, well, the language probably isn't English that they're written in. They're Russian. So that maybe is a bit interesting. So let's discuss that. Now, I have actually done this before. I wrote an article back in 2016 about how the Metro games are better when you play them in Russian. You'll find the link to that article in the description below. Although it is from a much younger me and I didn't choose the title, but my main issue with that piece is that it just isn't robust enough. So we're going to be more robust this time around. And to really get to the meat of this, let's first talk about something completely different. Let's first talk about Franz Kafka. Part 1. Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis. Alright, for those who are unfamiliar, who is Franz Kafka? Franz Kafka was a German modernist writer who was born in 1883 and died in 1924. He was only 40 years old when he died. This man was pretty much the basis of our idea of the tortured artist. He hated his job, worked in insurance, wrote in his free time, published few things in his lifetime, and pretty much hated everything about himself. Then, before his death, he asked his friend Max Brod to burn everything he'd ever written. Everything published and unpublished. So just destroy it all. But Brod didn't do that, thankfully, and he set about publishing all of Kafka's work instead. Much of it was unfinished and had to be pieced together and edited into a proper format. But once the work was properly published, it found an audience and became some of the most famous modernist prose writing ever published. Some of those books and stories became incredibly famous, most notably his novels The Trial and The Castle, the novella The Metamorphosis, and the short story The Penal Colony. He didn't write that much, and so these few things are most of what he wrote. He wrote only one other novel called America, but it's not as famous, and he also wrote a bunch of other short stories. But today, we're mostly going to be looking at The Metamorphosis. Alright, so what is The Metamorphosis? It's a novella about a man named Gregor Samsa, who one day wakes up and finds that he's turned into a giant insect. Now, most of us would think to ourselves, how did I turn into an insect? But his first thoughts after his transformation are not about what he's turned into, but rather anxious thoughts that he'll be late for work. The story progresses, and Gregor has to deal with his new body and how his family reacts to it. I won't elaborate further because it's worth a read if you want something nice and depressive. But we don't need to know the whole story for this discussion. We literally just need the first line. Why only the first line? Because we're going to be talking about translation and all the fun little issues that come with translation. For those who aren't able to speak multiple languages, it should be noted that different languages are rather different to each other. Different languages have different word order structures, etc., and sometimes they are words that just don't translate well or at all. Probably the most famous German word that can't be translated into English, and so has actually just entered the English language as a word, is Schadenfreude. This is that feeling of joy you get from seeing someone else's pain. So, for instance, watching someone fall over, get hurt in a humorous way, or even when you see someone get a punishment they deserve. You take joy in their suffering, in their pain. Now you see, that word just doesn't have a direct English translation. So if that can happen with a single word, imagine an entire sentence. And that is the problem with the Metamorphosis. The first line is pretty famous for this. So how about looking at that first line? Here's the line in German. I will read it myself, and so many apologies for mispronunciation. Als Gregor Samsa eins morgens aus Unhöring possibly, Traumen erwachte von Sicht in seinen Bett zu einen ungeheuren Ungezeifer verwandelt. Once again, many apologies. And here's the line in English. First, I'll translate it directly, word for word, which means it won't make sense. And I made this translation using Google Translate. As Gregor Samsa, one in the morning, out troubled dream awoke, found he themselves in his bed to one tremendous vermin transformed. So that translation doesn't work, but when proper translators translate something, they will change exact word choice, vocabulary, etc. They do this because they need to maintain the feeling of whatever's been translated and not just the content. Let's look at some professional translations now. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. That's from 1952. One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous verminous bug. That's from 1999. As Gregor Samsa awoke from unsettling dreams one morning, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. That one's from 2003. As Gregor Samsa woke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed into some kind of monstrous vermin. That's from 2009. When Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect. That one's from 2014. One morning, as Gregor Samsa woke from a fitful dream-filled sleep, he found that he had changed into an enormous bedbug. 2015. It's also my least favorite of the translations. Okay, so those are a few of the translations, but there are issues with things like word order and the vocabulary used. So let's look at the word Ungezeifer first. This word is translated as insect, bug, or vermin most of the time. But there isn't actually a direct translation of this word in English. The word is actually pretty old and means something that is an unclean animal of some kind, meaning an animal that is not suitable for sacrifice. So do you see the issue here? It doesn't have a translation, does it? And it certainly doesn't translate as insect. And what about unheuren Traumen? Probably pronouncing that wrong. This is a less contentious one, but it's translated as uneasy dreams twice, and then as anxious dreams, unsettling dreams, troubled dreams, and fitful dream-filled sleep. So no one can agree on how to exactly translate it. Lastly, let's look at verwandelt, and this is almost always translated as transformed, but in the original German, the word order places this word at the end of the sentence. However, in English, the verb is never at the very end of a sentence, unless you're Yoda, so this is actually one of the biggest forms of contention in translations of the Metamorphosis. Because in German, it ends with a nice punchy verb, but in English, it ends with a noun. He is a gigantic insect transformed, not he is transformed into a gigantic insect. You see, with the verb at the very end, it has more punch, but in English it would be deemed grammatically incorrect. So, do you see how difficult this is? Translation can change things completely. Another particularly difficult thing to translate is something like poetry. How do you translate something that uses exact syllable counts, rhymes, and specific topography? Prose is far easier to translate, but poetry is another issue entirely. We're not going to discuss that in depth, but it's worth considering for a bit. There are things like Eintjie Kroch's poetry collection Body Bereft, or at least that's the English title. The Afrikaans title is Verweerskrif. So you might think that Verweerskrif means body bereft, or bereft of body, or something similar, right? Well, it actually translates to rough writing. I personally can't speak on the translation of the poetry itself, because my Afrikaans is a bit rough, but the author did the translation herself, so she decided on it. But could something have been lost regardless? There's also the work of someone like Herta Müller, and while her work may be prose, it's also very poetically written, and so the text may become somewhat stunted, wouldn't it? And what about some Kafka again? One of his novels is, in English, called The Trial, but in German it's called Der Prozess, which directly translates to the process and not the trial, and those things are not exactly the same thing. The trial isn't even really about a trial, it's more about the whole process that goes into the specific mysterious trial that the protagonist, Joseph K., has to go through. So, translation is a fun old issue. With translation, you maintain the overall content, but you lose a lot in the form. You lose how it's done. You potentially lose a hell of a lot. So poetry is the worst thing to translate. Prose is a bit better, but games? Well, much of the time, translation changes very little in the game. Games often don't require this level of precision when they are translated, but does translation still affect it? Can it? Can it change the feeling, the authenticity? And this is where we have to ask a question about the Metro games. Is it better in English or in Russian? Part 2. Dubs versus subs.
So, let's have a look at the game with the standard English dub.
Do something! Get off your ass! Go find the money to buy the medicine.
Good weapons make good soldiers.
Does that sound more authentic? Or does this?
Никогда больше не делай так. Связи, ресурсов и...
Извини, я больше так не буду. Господи, да за что это нам? Ну скажи.
Now, I can't hear what you think, but I'm going to take it that the Russian voiceover is significantly better than the English version. It feels like it really fits inside the world, whereas the English actually sounds kind of offensive. It's a comical Russian accent, but we'll get back to that soon enough. First, some of you may recognize this debate. It's the debate over subs versus dubs. A debate that people who are familiar with anime will probably recognize well. Which is better? Anime with an English dub and no subtitles to read, or the original Japanese dub but you have to read subtitles? There are many proponents of both sides of this, but the super hardcore anime fandom tends to lean towards subs. It's better to watch something in Japanese and read along with the subtitles than watch something with an inferior English voiceover that just doesn't grasp the dialogue as it should be grasped. But here's the big difference between anime and a game like Metro though. When you watch an anime that's set in Japan, the English voice actors don't put on comical Japanese accents. They use neutral, often unaccented English, so why is it fine for this to happen with Japanese characters but not Russians? How about we demonstrate this? Here's a short anime scene the way it should be done in English.
Hello, I am Mr. Onizuka. I would like to welcome you to my class. Hello? Anyone?
Ungrateful little jerks. I've got half a mind to pull out a whole six-pack of whoop-outs right now. Do you realize that I could kill all of you if I didn't have a moral obligation as someone striving to be a teacher? I would immediately... Huh?
Now that's fine, isn't it? But can you imagine if they made it like this?
Hello, I'm Mr. Onizuka and I'd like to welcome you to my class. Hello? Anyone? You ungrateful little jerks. I've got to have a mind to pull out a whole six-pack of whoop-outs right now. Do you realize I could kill all of you if I didn't have a moral obligation for someone striving to be a teacher? I will immediately...
You'd take that second one less seriously, wouldn't you? Hell, you'd probably see it as offensive. It is offensive. So why is it fine for us to do that when it comes to a Russian accent? But definitely not when it comes to an offensive Japanese accent. Questions. Part 3. Metro 2033 in Russian. We've spoken about Franz Kafka, anime, and even an Afrikaans poet, but what about Metro itself? Well, here's where the subs versus dubs issue becomes more apparent. You see, while the Metro novels can certainly be translated into English and all will be well, although of course I can't speak Russian and so I don't know if something was lost in the translation process, games are a bit different. We can make the subs versus dubs argument with anime because it's static. We just watch the action going on. We don't control any of the characters. Once you throw interactivity into the mix, things become a bit harder. You don't want to be reading subtitles in the middle of a huge firefight. You don't want to be fighting off monsters and Nazis and spiders and sneaking around and firing a flamethrower and read subtitles. It can get rather difficult. Some people complain about having to read the subtitles of something like anime or a foreign film. For some, it's because they're lazy. For others, it's because they can't read that quickly. And for others, it could be a learning disability or something similar. We don't know the reason someone would choose to use the dub of something. And so being disparaging towards someone who prefers dubs over subs is basically just being a jerk. But the issue of paying attention to visuals and writing at the same time is amped up in games because of the aforementioned interactivity. For someone like me, who uses subtitles even when watching things in English, and I've done so since I was a kid, even before I watched a single scene of anime, it's generally pretty easy to follow along with the subtitles in Metro. I can do it, but others may struggle. At parts I struggle too, such as intense firefights, but the reading ability of the one playing is only half the issue in a game like Metro. Many Asian games that come over to the West retain their original voice acting, and so only the written language has been translated, but many of these games tend to be JRPGs, and JRPGs are nothing if not turn-based and patient. Things don't get frantic in the way they would in a game like Metro, and for this reason everything is translated for us, but when the Metro games were made, this was not taken into account. See if you can spot the issue in this bit of the game.
Артём, проснулся наконец. К нам скоро придет Хантер. У него-то всегда самые свежие новости с других станций. Вставай, тебе тоже будет интересно послушать. Пойдем, Артём, пойдем.
Дерьмо, свиньи, витамины. Я не через такое прошел. Я этого не боюсь. И что ты хочешь сделать с черными?
Did you see it? The game, when chatting to an important character, happily highlights the language and gives me a nice translation in the subtitles. But the subtitles ignore these other unimportant characters. We just miss the possible world-building exposition that these characters could be presenting us if we play in Russian. We don't know what they're talking about. How about we see what they were saying?
Pigs, disease. I've been through worse, and I'm not giving up. Alex, what's your plan for the darkness? Hunt them all down and shoot them. What a joke.
That information was not necessary for the plot, but that information certainly did add something to the world. Sure, it can be ignored, but do you want to lose whole sections of world building just for the authenticity of the original voiceover? A solution might be to have more robust subtitles, but that doesn't work in a hustle and bustle place like this.
Что-то за этот канат как дернет. Мы зовем замыкающего. Ничего, тише. Я сам радист.
Помню, читал где-то, что Калашников очень гордился своим запрещенным.
Да, единая система.
You can't have subtitles for every possible string of dialogue going on here. All the dialogue is layered on top of each other to emphasize the noisy, crowded, busy atmosphere of the market. So we run into an issue. In English, we get the full narrative, but in Russian, we get improved atmosphere. My personal solution was to play it in English first, get the whole story, and then replay it in Russian. You might not want to replay things though, and so this presents a problem. We don't know what all we lose when we translate things, but it's also physically impossible to learn every language so as to experience art as it was created. But can we get around this problem? Is it even physically possible to get around this issue? Concluding remarks.
Language is a fascinating thing. It does fascinate some of us a bit more than others, but I think it's always worth keeping in mind. Now, no matter what you do, things will always be lost in translation. And that's fine. Things get lost in translation. You can't recover it. That's fine. But things are always lost in translation. And if you think just because you're watching something with subtitles means that you're getting the full picture, that is not necessarily the case. Not at all. But there isn't really a solution to this. It's just kind of something to keep in mind. And that's pretty much all I have to say on that.